My mom played audio of me crying at church and called it spiritual cleansing. When I finally asked her why she needed to record every moment of my life, she smiled and said, "Because secrets are how monsters are made." I stayed silent. That was 9 months ago. This morning, she was standing outside the courthouse, clutching a USB and shaking. "When did your parents treat you like a science experiment?" My parents eliminated all physical contact from my life when I was 8 because they said human touch was making children weak and dependent, and they wanted to create the world's first truly self-sufficient child. My parents were behavioral psychologists who blamed society's problems on excessive physical affection. Dad had published papers about how hugging created emotional weakness. Mom studied isolated children in Romanian orphanages and decided they were more resilient than touched children. They'd make me watch documentaries about feral children while explaining how strong these kids were without human contact. I once reached for my mom's hand during a scary movie, and she jerked away like I'd burned her. "Touch is a crutch," she said. "You're already too dependent." When I was 8, my parents announced their revolutionary child-rearing experiment. No more hugs, hand-holding, hair ruffling, or physical contact of any kind. They wore gloves around me to avoid accidental touches. "We're giving you the gift of complete self-reliance," Mom explained from across the room. "You'll thank us when you're the strongest person alive." They installed cameras to ensure no one was weakening me with affection. If a teacher patted my shoulder or a relative tried to hug me, they'd file complaints. The isolation was immediate agony. Humans need touch like they need food, but my parents treated it like poison. They'd stand 3 feet away during conversations. They modified our house so they could care for me without contact, using tongs to hand me things, and automated systems for everything possible. When I cried, they'd observe from the doorway, taking notes about my withdrawal symptoms. At first, I used school as an escape, high-fiving and hugging my friends whenever I could, but my parents put a stop to that quickly and pulled me out for homeschooling. I started deliberately falling just to feel the ground hit my body, craving any physical sensation. My parents were delighted by my self-soothing behaviors. I tried different ways to get touch. If my parents let me go to the store, I would bump into people accidentally, stand too close in lines, anything for brief contact. But my parents always found out. They started dressing me in clothes with "no touching contagious condition" written on them. They told everyone I had a skin condition that made touch painful for me and hazardous for them. People would jump back if they accidentally brushed against me, apologizing while I wanted to scream. By age 10, I developed visible problems. I rocked constantly, hit myself for stimulation, and pulled out hair just to feel something. The breaking point came when I got seriously sick with food poisoning. I was hospitalized, delirious with fever, and the nurses needed to physically examine me. My parents tried to stop them, but I was too sick for their insanity. When the nurse checked my lymph nodes, the gentle pressure of her fingers on my neck made me sob so hard they had to sedate me. I hadn't felt human touch in 5 years. The nurses reported my extreme touch starvation to social services, but my parents had anticipated this. They'd been building a legal case about their right to raise a contact-free child, complete with forged research and hired experts. They convinced the judge this was legitimate science, not abuse. With their credentials, it was actually believable, and the case was dismissed. After that, they escalated. They built a completely touch-proof environment with padded walls I couldn't feel through thick clothing and floors that were always either too hot or too cold to touch comfortably. They were erasing every possible source of physical sensation. "You're so close to breakthrough," Dad observed from behind glass. "Soon you won't even remember wanting touch." He was right. By 13, I was forgetting what hugs felt like. The memory of my mother's hand in mine was so distant it felt like a dream. I'd watch videos of people embracing and feel nothing but confusion. My parents celebrated this as success, documenting my evolution beyond physical needs. But then one of their colleagues visited to observe me. Dr. Mills was supposed to validate their experiment, but when she saw me, her face changed. She insisted on conducting a private interview. My parents reluctantly agreed, watching through cameras, but Dr. Mills did something unexpected. She turned off her microphone, pulled out a pen, and wrote on her notepad, "I'm going to help you." She conducted a normal interview out loud while writing her real observations. "This is severe abuse. I'm reporting them. Be ready." My heart pounded. After 5 years, someone finally saw what they were doing to me. But my parents must have sensed something, because the moment Dr. Mills left, Dad locked me in my touch-proof room. "We're moving the experiment to the next phase," he said through the intercom. "Complete sensory elimination." I watched through my window as trucks arrived with medical equipment. Mom explained cheerfully that they'd developed a gel that would numb all nerve endings. "Like a full-body anesthetic you can live in," she said. "You'll finally be free from all physical sensation, not just touch." They'd already tested it on animals. The rats floated peacefully in vats, unable to feel anything. "We'll start with your hands tomorrow," Dad announced. "By next week, your whole body will be beyond the need for feeling." I pressed my palms against the glass, trying to memorize the sensation while I still could. Somewhere Dr. Mills was hopefully making phone calls, but it was too late. Once the gel numbed my body, I'd never feel touch again, and there would be nothing Dr. Mills or anyone could do to save me from this prison. The next morning arrived too quickly. I hadn't slept, spending the night testing every surface in my room, pressing my fingertips against walls, floors, even my own skin, trying to store up sensations. My parents entered wearing surgical gear, wheeling in a metal cart with vials of clear gel. Mom prepared syringes while Dad set up recording equipment. They moved with practiced efficiency, discussing my treatment like I wasn't there. I backed into the corner, hands behind me, feeling the wall's texture through my shirt. Dad approached with restraints. I tried to dodge, but he cornered me, using a pole with loops to secure my wrists without touching me. They'd thought of everything. Mom wheeled the cart closer as they forced me into a chair. The door burst open. Dr. Mills stood there with 2 police officers. My parents froze. Relief flooded through me until I saw the officers' confused expressions as they took in the medical equipment. My parents immediately shifted into professional mode. Dad calmly explained they were administering prescribed medication for my condition. Mom showed falsified medical documents. They prepared for this. Dr. Mills argued with the officers, insisting this was abuse, but my parents had answers for everything. They claimed Dr. Mills was a disgruntled colleague trying to sabotage their research. The officers looked uncertain, caught between 2 groups of professionals. Then Mom played their trump card. She produced a video of me from last week, rocking and hitting myself, looking disturbed. She explained these were symptoms of my rare neurological condition that made touch painful. The gel was an experimental treatment to ease my suffering. The officers' expressions shifted from suspicion to sympathy. One asked me directly if my parents were hurting me. I tried to explain, but the words came out jumbled. Years of isolation had damaged my ability to communicate under pressure. I sounded exactly like the disturbed child my parents claimed I was. Dr. Mills kept fighting, but the officers were convinced. They apologized for the intrusion and left. Dr. Mills gave me one last desperate look before my parents escorted her out, threatening legal action if she returned. Alone with them again, I watched Dad prepare the first syringe. Mom held the camera, documenting everything. They weren't angry about the interruption. If anything, they seemed energized by successfully defending their experiment. Dad approached with the needle. I thrashed against the restraints but couldn't break free. The needle went into my left palm. Within seconds, numbness spread across my hand. I watched my fingers move but felt nothing. The sensation of touch, my last connection to the world, was being erased. They injected my right palm next. Both hands went completely numb. I tried to make fists but couldn't tell if my fingers were moving without looking. Mom noted my reactions while Dad prepared more syringes. Over the next hour, they systematically injected the gel at my arms. The numbness crept higher with each dose. By the time they reached my elbows, I couldn't feel anything below them. My arms might as well have been prosthetics. They finally stopped, saying they'd continue tomorrow. The partial numbness was worse than complete loss would have been. I could still feel my shoulders and torso, making the contrast unbearable. I kept forgetting my hands were numb and trying to touch things, only to feel nothing. That night, I discovered something. While I couldn't feel with my hands, I could could still use them. I practiced moving without sensation, learning to navigate by sight alone. My parents had taken feeling but not function. I used my numb hands to search my room differently than before. Without worrying about sensation, I could reach into spaces I'd previously avoided. Behind the ventilation grate, my fingers found something unexpected, a folded paper. I carefully extracted it using visual guidance. Dr. Mills had left a note during her visit. My eyes strained to read her rushed handwriting. They're moving you tomorrow night. Overheard them arranging transport to their private lab. The parents wearing gloves to avoid touching their own child. Makes me wonder what kind of mental gymnastics they're doing to justify this as science rather than cruelty. Dr. Mills slipping that note during her visit seems almost too convenient. Be ready. My heart sank. A private lab meant complete isolation. No chance of outside help. I had one day before they took me somewhere no one would ever find me. The next morning brought more injections. They numbed my forearms completely, working toward my shoulders. I didn't resist this time, saving my energy. I needed them to think I was accepting the treatment. During the afternoon session, something changed. Dad received a phone call that made him step outside. Mom continued preparing syringes, but I caught her glancing nervously at the door. When Dad returned, his expression was grim. They whispered urgently. I caught fragments. Social services. Court order. Mills filed an emergency petition. My parents' carefully constructed defense was under real scrutiny now. They accelerated the treatment schedule. Instead of gradual injections, they prepared multiple syringes. They were racing against time, trying to complete the experiment before anyone could stop them. As they worked, I noticed something they'd overlooked. The restraint pole Dad had used earlier was propped against the wall. With effort, I could probably reach it with my numb but functional hands. Mom approached with more syringes. I let my body go limp, feigning unconsciousness from the stress. They'd seen me shut down before during overwhelming situations. Mom paused, consulting with Dad. They decided to monitor my vital signs before continuing. While they prepared monitoring equipment, I slowly moved my numb hand toward the pole. Without sensation, I had to watch carefully to guide my movements. My fingers closed around it just as Dad turned back. I swung awkwardly, the pole connecting with the cart. Syringes scattered across the floor. Mom jumped back while Dad lunged for the pole. I couldn't feel his grip, but saw him trying to wrestle it away. The door opened again. This time, Dr. Mills had returned with different officers and a social worker. She'd learned from her mistake, bringing authorities who specialized in child abuse cases. My parents tried their routine again, but these officers weren't easily fooled. The social worker examined the scene, a child partially paralyzed with mysterious injections, fighting desperately against her parents. She made a call for immediate protective custody. My parents protested, demanding warrants and threatening lawsuits, but the social worker had emergency authority when a child was in imminent danger. The officers moved to separate me from my parents. That's when Mom made her final move. She grabbed one of the fallen syringes and lunged toward me, trying to inject my neck. If she could numb my vocal cords, I couldn't testify against them. An officer caught her arm just in time. The syringe fell, shattering on the floor. Both my parents were restrained while the social worker called for medical transport. At the hospital, doctors ran tests on the gel in my system. It was reversible, they said, but would take months of treatment. The numbness in my hands and arms would fade gradually. I might never regain full sensation, but I'd have some feeling again. Dr. Mills stayed with me during the initial exams. She explained how she'd fought to get the right authorities involved, learning which departments would take the threat seriously. She'd saved me just in time. My parents were arrested on multiple charges. Their colleagues distanced themselves from the experiment. The research community condemned their methods. Their reputations were destroyed along with their freedom. But I was finally free from their twisted experiment. The foster family who took me in was warned about my touch aversion. They didn't force physical contact, but made it clear hugs were available whenever I felt ready. It took 3 months before I could shake someone's hand without panicking. 6 months before I accepted my first hug in 7 years. The sensation was overwhelming, but I held on, feeling human warmth against me. My parents had tried to evolution-proof me against needing touch. They failed. Humans are built for connection, for contact, for the simple comfort of another person's hand and ours. No amount of behavioral conditioning could change that fundamental need. The gel's effects faded slowly. Sensation returned in patches, pins, and needles giving way to real feeling. Each recovered nerve ending was a small victory against their experiment. Dr. Mills testified at their trial. I gave my statement through written testimony, still struggling with verbal communication. The judge sentenced them to prison and permanent loss of their licenses. They'd never experiment on another child. In the end, their obsession with creating a touch-free human only proved how essential touch really is. They documented my deterioration in detail, creating evidence of their own cruelty. The revolutionary experiment became a cautionary tale in psychology textbooks. I still have bad days. Sometimes I forget people can touch me safely. Other times I can't get enough contact, making up for lost years. But I'm healing, one hug at a time. My parents wanted to make me the world's first self-sufficient child. Instead, they taught me that humans need each other, need connection, need the simple comfort of touch. Their failure was my salvation. The foster home placement lasted exactly 3 weeks. My new guardians, Catherine and Sebastian, were kind people who'd fostered dozens of children, but they'd never encountered someone like me. They tried their best, leaving doors open so I could approach them, announcing their movements to avoid startling me. Catherine would sit on the opposite end of the couch during movie nights, slowly inching closer over days until I could tolerate her presence nearby. But my parents weren't finished with their experiment. The first sign came through a letter delivered by their lawyer. They were appealing the custody decision, claiming the state had no right to interfere with their therapeutic protocol. The letter included documentation from 3 psychologists who supposedly supported their methods. Catherine's hands shook as she read it to me from across the kitchen table. Child Services assured us the appeal would fail, but my parents had connections throughout the academic community. Former colleagues who owed them favors began submitting affidavits about their groundbreaking research. They painted the touch deprivation as a legitimate treatment for a fabricated condition they'd invented just for me. Meanwhile, the gel's effects were proving harder to reverse than doctors anticipated. The numbness in my arms came and went unpredictably. Some mornings I'd wake with full sensation, only to lose it again by noon. The inconsistency made recovery harder. I'd finally work up courage to accept Catherine's offered handshake, only to feel nothing when our palms met. My parents exploited this during their first supervised visitation. The social worker, Ms. Fedor, sat in the corner taking notes while Mom and Dad maintained their 3-foot distance. They spoke calmly about wanting to complete my treatment and showed charts documenting my progress under their care. When Ms. Fedor asked why I seemed afraid of them, Dad produced videos of me before the experiment, playing happily without any signs of trauma. They'd been planning this defense for years, creating a false narrative where I'd always been troubled and their extreme methods were a last resort. Mom presented forged medical records suggesting I'd been diagnosed with sensory processing disorder as a toddler. Dad showed emails from fictional specialists recommending touch limitation. Ms. Fedor wasn't fooled, but she had to document everything for the court. My parents used the visitation to study my current condition, noting how I still flinched when anyone moved too quickly, how I kept my arms crossed protectively. They were gathering evidence that I was still sick and needed their cure. After they left, I found a tiny device under my chair, a recording device, no bigger than a button. They were still monitoring me, still collecting data. Catherine helped me search the room and we found 2 more devices. My parents had turned the visitation into another phase of their experiment. The foster home security increased after that. Sebastian installed new locks and cameras. Catherine started checking my room for devices every night, but my parents were too clever for simple precautions. They began their counterattack through the academic community. Papers started appearing in minor journals questioning the hysteria around touch deprivation. Mom gave interviews to psychology podcasts about the misunderstanding of their work. They were building a narrative where they were persecuted scientists, and I was a troubled child being used by the system. Dr. Mills fought back, publishing rebuttals and organizing colleagues to speak out. But my parents had spent years building their reputation. For every psychologist who condemned them, they found two who defend their theoretical framework without endorsing the actual experiment. The legal battle intensified. My parents' lawyer filed motion after motion, demanding access to my medical records, psychological evaluations, even my foster home's daily logs. They wanted to prove I was deteriorating without their care. Catherine and Sebastian had to hire their own lawyer just to protect our privacy. During this chaos, I was trying to heal. Physical therapy helped restore some sensation, but progress was slow. The therapist, a gentle woman named Kat, had to work without actually touching me at first. She'd demonstrate exercises while I copied them, gradually working up to minimal contact. The first time she guided my arm through a movement, I cried from the simple pressure of her fingers. My parents must have been monitoring these sessions somehow because their next legal filing included details about my therapy that should have been confidential. Mom going for the neck injection like some kind of villain from a spy movie? That's taking helicopter parent to a whole new level. More like mad scientist parent with a side of completely losing it. They argued that my emotional reactions to touch proved their theory correct, that I was psychologically dependent on physical contact now, and they'd been right to eliminate it. The custody hearing was set for 6 months after my removal. My parents spent every day preparing, while I struggled with basic human interactions. Catherine found me a therapist who specialized in attachment disorders, but even she was shocked by what my parents had done. We worked on simple goals, sitting next to someone without panicking, accepting a pat on the shoulder, tolerating brief hugs. Every small improvement I made in foster care became evidence that I was unstable and needed consistent treatment. When I finally let Catherine brush my hair, my parents filed a report claiming I was forming unhealthy attachments. When I managed a brief hug with Sebastian, they called it regression to infantile behavior. My parents somehow obtained recordings, probably through more hidden devices, and used them in court filings. They twisted every word, every emotional breakthrough, into evidence of pathology. When I told my therapist about missing human touch, my parents claimed I'd developed an addiction. When I described the pain of isolation, they called it withdrawal from therapeutic intervention. Dr. Mills remained my strongest advocate, but my parents attacked her credibility too. They dug up an old research dispute from her graduate school days, spinning it into a pattern of professional jealousy. They suggested she was using me to advance her own career by opposing their innovative methods. The stress began affecting my physical recovery. The numbness in my arms returned with a vengeance during particularly difficult days. My parents noted this in their court filings, arguing that the instability of foster care was harming my neurological condition. They presented themselves as the stable, scientific option compared to the emotional chaos of traditional parenting. 5 months into foster care, they made their boldest move. Mom published a book about their experiment, portraying herself as a misunderstood pioneer. She carefully avoided admitting to anything illegal, framing the touch deprivation as a thought experiment that had been misinterpreted. The book sold well in certain academic circles, generating sympathy for my parents among their peers. The book's publicity tour became a weapon. Mom gave interviews where she seemed reasonable and caring, discussing child development theory while painting me as a difficult child who'd been helped by their unconventional approach. She never mentioned the restraints, the forced injections, the systematic torture. Instead, she talked about boundaries and independence. Dad followed with a series of journal articles refining their theories. He proposed a modified touch protocol that sounded less extreme but was essentially the same thing with better marketing. Young psychology students began defending their ideas online, not knowing the full truth. My parents were rewriting history, turning their abuse into academic discourse. I watched this campaign from the foster home feeling helpless. Catherine tried to shield me from the media coverage, but I needed to know what they were doing. Every interview, every article was another move in their game to get me back. They were building a case that they were reformed, enlightened parents who'd been misunderstood. The guardian ad litem assigned to represent my interests was a tired woman named Patricia, who'd seen too many custody battles. She interviewed me multiple times, asking the same questions different ways. I could tell she was sympathetic, but she was also overwhelmed by my parents' documentation. They provided hundreds of pages of research supporting their methods. My foster siblings tried to help in their own ways. One girl who'd aged out of the system came back to testify about the difference between real abuse and what she saw in our home. A boy who'd been adopted years ago wrote a letter about how Catherine and Sebastian had helped him heal. But my parents dismissed these as anecdotal evidence compared to their scientific approach. I couldn't let others fight this battle for me. I began writing my own statement, documenting everything I could remember. The early days when they first started wearing gloves, the cameras installed to monitor any unauthorized touching, the escalating isolation that had nearly destroyed my ability to connect with other humans. Writing it was agony. Every memory brought back the sensation of reaching for comfort and finding only empty air. I described the birthday parties where no one could hug me, the holidays spent watching other families embrace while I stood apart. I wrote about the nights I'd cried myself to sleep, arms wrapped around my own body because it was the only touch I was allowed. Catherine helped me organize the statement, though she had to sit across the room while I wrote. Even after months of progress, having someone too close while I relived those memories was unbearable. Sebastian provided technical support, helping me find dates and details that would corroborate my timeline. They never pushed, never insisted on more than I could give. My parents' lawyer tried to block my statement, arguing I was too emotionally compromised to provide reliable testimony. They submitted video footage of my therapy sessions, showing moments where I'd broken down while discussing the abuse. They claimed this proved I wasn't stable enough to participate in the hearing. The judge disagreed, but allowed my parents to submit their own version of events. Their statement was a masterpiece of manipulation, acknowledging errors in judgment while maintaining their behavior came from a place of love and scientific curiosity. They portrayed themselves as parents who'd gotten caught up in their research, losing sight of their child's needs. As the hearing approached, the numbness in my arms grew worse. Stress always triggered the symptoms, and knowing I'd have to face my parents in court was almost unbearable. Talk about parents who can't take a hint. Publishing a book about your thought experiment while trying to get your kid back is certainly one way to show you've changed. Some mornings I woke unable to feel anything from my shoulders down, as if my body was protecting itself from the possibility of returning to their care. Catherine found me one night pressing my numb hands against the radiator, trying to feel something, anything. She sat on the floor near me, not touching but present. She told me about her own childhood, about a mother who'd been cold and distant, though nothing like what I'd experienced. She understood the hunger for connection, the fear that you're somehow broken beyond repair. The foster home became a fortress in those final days. Sebastian checked for recording devices twice daily. Catherine screened all mail and phone calls. My therapy sessions moved to a secure location after we found another hidden microphone. My parents were escalating their surveillance, desperate to gather more data for their case. Dr. Mills visited the night before the hearing. She brought letters from former students of my parents, people who'd been disturbed by their theories even before the experiment. One letter described how Dad had suggested using orphanages as natural laboratories for studying touch deprivation. Another recalled Mom proposing that hospitals limit physical contact with newborns to create stronger children. These letters painted a picture of systematic planning that went back years. My parents hadn't simply gone too far with one experiment. They'd been building toward this their entire careers, searching for a test subject they could completely control. Having their own child had given them the perfect opportunity. I practiced my testimony with the guardian ad litem, though Patricia warned me I might not be called to speak. The judge would decide based on what was best for me, which might mean protecting me from the trauma of testifying, but I needed to be ready, needed to find words for experiences that defied description. The morning of the hearing arrived gray and cold. I dressed carefully in clothes Catherine had helped me pick, soft fabrics that wouldn't trigger sensory memories. My arms were partially numb, but I could move them normally. From the outside, I probably looked like any other teenager teenager heading to court for a custody hearing. Inside, I was preparing for war. My parents would use every psychological trick they knew. They'd present themselves as loving, misguided scientists who'd learned from their mistakes. They'd have experts in evidence and elaborate explanations. But I had something more powerful, the truth of what it felt like to be their experiment. Catherine and Sebastian drove me to the courthouse in silence. They'd offered words of encouragement earlier, but now they understood I needed quiet to prepare. As we pulled into the parking lot, I saw my parents' car already there. Mom and Dad stood by the entrance with their lawyer, looking professional and concerned. They dressed carefully too. Mom wore soft, approachable colors instead of her usual stark white lab coat. Dad had trimmed his beard and chosen a tie with a subtle pattern that suggested warmth. They were performing the role of reformed parents, every detail calculated to show they'd changed. But I saw the truth in their positioning. They still stood exactly 3 feet apart, maintaining the same distance they'd kept from me. Their hands stayed carefully controlled, never gesturing too close to each other. Even now, even performing for the court, they couldn't fully hide their revulsion for human contact. I walked past them without acknowledging their presence. Catherine and Sebastian flanked me, not touching but close enough that I could feel their warmth. Dr. Mills waited inside with our legal team, her face set with determination. Patricia nodded as I took my seat, acknowledging that I'd made it this far. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, more like a conference room than the grand halls of justice from movies. The judge entered, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes but a firm expression. She'd read everything, Patricia had assured me. She knew what was at stake. My parents' lawyer began with a measured presentation about rehabilitation and second chances. He acknowledged the unconventional nature of their experiment while emphasizing their credentials and contributions to psychology. He painted them as brilliant minds who'd temporarily lost their way, now ready to be proper parents. Our lawyer countered with the reality of what they'd done. She presented medical records showing the physical damage from touch deprivation. She submitted my therapy notes documenting the psychological trauma. She called Dr. Mills to testify about the long-term effects of sensory isolation on developing minds. My parents watched it all with clinical detachment, taking notes as if this were an academic presentation rather than a fight for their child. I recognized their strategy. By treating it as an intellectual exercise, they could avoid confronting the emotional reality of their abuse. The hearing stretched through the morning as experts testified on both sides. My parents had found psychologists who would validate their theories in abstract terms, careful never to endorse the actual experiment. Our side brought child development specialists who explained in devastating detail how touch deprivation affected growing brains. During a break, I overheard Mom talking to their lawyer about phase 2 of something. My blood ran cold. They were still planning, still experimenting, still viewing me as a test subject rather than their child. Whatever remorse they performed for the court was just another manipulation. The afternoon session brought a development I hadn't anticipated. The judge called for my testimony. My parents' lawyer immediately objected, but the judge overruled him. She wanted to hear from me directly. I walked to the witness stand on legs that felt disconnected from my body. The numbness in my arms had spread to my shoulders, making me feel like I was floating. Catherine gave me an encouraging nod from the gallery. Sebastian sat beside her, hands clasped tightly. The judge asked me to describe my experience in my own words. I started slowly, explaining the early days of the experiment, how my parents had gradually eliminated all physical contact, the cameras, the gloves, the 3-foot rule. My voice grew stronger as I continued, describing the isolation that had nearly destroyed me. My parents took notes throughout my testimony, their faces showing no emotion. Mom occasionally whispered to their lawyer. Dad studied me like I was presenting research findings rather than describing torture. Their clinical detachment made my skin crawl. I described finding Dr. Mills's note, the race against time before the private lab transfer. The judge's expression darkened when I explained the sensory elimination gel. I showed her my arms, demonstrating the patches where sensation hadn't fully returned. Some areas might never recover completely. When I finished, my parents' lawyer approached for cross-examination. He tried to paint me as confused, traumatized by the foster care system rather than my parents' experiment. But I'd spent months preparing for this moment. I answered each question calmly, sticking to facts rather than emotions. The lawyer asked about my current symptoms, trying to suggest I needed my parents' continued treatment. I explained how the numbness worsened under stress, particularly when thinking about returning to their care. The implication was clear without me having to state it directly. Dr. Mills testified next, presenting evidence of my parents' long-term planning. She'd uncovered grant proposals from years ago, outlining experiments remarkably similar to what they'd done to me. The judge studied these documents carefully, her frown deepening. My parents' expert witnesses followed, but their testimony felt hollow after mine. They spoke in abstractions about attachment theory and independence training. None of them could explain why a child needed to be injected with nerve-deadening gel to become self-sufficient. During another break, I noticed Mom frantically texting someone. Dad pulled her aside for an intense whispered conversation. They kept glancing at me, then at the door. Something was happening. The afternoon wore on with more testimony. Catherine described my progress in foster care, the slow journey toward accepting human contact. She explained how my parents' surveillance and manipulation had repeatedly set back my recovery. Sebastian testified about the security measures they'd had to implement just to give me a safe space to heal. As the final witness prepared to testify, the courtroom door opened. A woman entered, looking nervous but determined. She was young, probably a graduate student. Mom's face went pale when she saw her. The woman approached the judge's bench and spoke quietly. The judge's eyebrows rose. She called both lawyers forward for a sidebar conference. My parents shifted uncomfortably in their seats. When the lawyers returned, our attorney looked grimly satisfied. The judge announced that new evidence had come to light. The woman was one of Mom's research assistants who'd helped prepare the sensory elimination gel. She'd been having nightmares about what they'd planned to do to me. The assistant testified that my parents had prepared enough gel to numb my entire body. They discussed keeping me in a medically induced coma while completing the treatment. The private lab had a room specially designed for long-term sensory deprivation. They'd even researched feeding tubes and waste management systems. My parents' lawyer objected repeatedly, but the damage was done. The assistant had brought documentation, emails discussing the logistics of complete sensory elimination. Mom had written about creating a perfect test subject who could survive without any physical sensation. Dad tried to stand, to say something, but his lawyer pulled him back down. Their parents wrote emails about feeding tubes and turning her into a perfect test subject. This research assistant showing up with proof feels too convenient, but those specific medical plans she's describing sound disturbingly real for something made up on the spot. Mom's carefully constructed facade finally cracked. She glared at the assistant with pure hatred. For the first time all day, she showed real emotion. The judge had heard enough. She called a recess to review all evidence and make her decision. We had 2 hours to wait. Catherine and Sebastian took me to a quiet room where I could decompress. My arms were completely numb now, hanging uselessly at my sides. Dr. Mills joined us, looking exhausted but hopeful. She'd been fighting this battle for months, using every connection she had to protect me. The research assistant's testimony had been her doing. She tracked down everyone who'd worked with my parents, looking for someone whose conscience outweighed their fear. Patricia, the guardian ad litem, stopped by to check on me. She said the judge seemed deeply disturbed by the evidence. The sensory elimination plan had crossed a line even my parents' sympathizers couldn't defend. No one could argue that complete body numbing was therapeutic. 2 hours felt like 2 years. When we returned to the courtroom, my parents sat rigidly in their seats. Their lawyer looked defeated. Mom had stopped taking notes. Dad stared straight ahead, not even glancing my way. The judge's decision was swift and decisive. My parents' parental rights were terminated permanently. They were prohibited from any contact with me until I turned 18, and then only if I initiated it. The judge recommended criminal charges be pursued for child endangerment and assault, but she didn't stop there. The judge ordered my parents to undergo psychological evaluation themselves. Their obsession with eliminating human touch suggested deeper issues that needed addressing. She also reported them to the medical board and academic review committees. My parents' lawyer tried to argue for visitation rights, but the judge shut him down. She cited the research assistant's testimony about their plans for complete sensory elimination. Parents who would rob their child of all physical sensation had forfeited any claim to parenthood. As court officers prepared to escort my parents out, Mom turned to look at me. Her expression was unreadable. Dad gathered his papers methodically, still treating this like a failed experiment rather than the loss of his child. They left without attempting to speak to me. The numbness in my arms began to fade as we left the courthouse. Whether from stress relief or coincidence, sensation tingled back into my shoulders and upper arms. Catherine noticed me flexing my fingers and smiled. Sebastian suggested we get ice cream to celebrate, then caught himself, remembering I might not be ready for such a normal family activity. But I was ready. We went to a small shop near the courthouse. I held the cone myself, feeling the cold through my partially numb fingers. It wasn't much, but it was progress. Catherine and Sebastian sat across from me, maintaining the distance I needed while sharing in the moment. Dr. Mills had to leave for another appointment but promised to visit soon. She'd become more than an advocate. She was proof that some adults could be trusted. Patricia congratulated me on my testimony and said she'd never seen a child handle cross-examination so well. That night back at the foster home, I sat in my room processing what had happened. My parents were gone. They couldn't hurt me anymore. The private lab would never receive its test subject. The remaining gel would be destroyed, not injected into my body. Catherine knocked gently, asking if I needed anything. I told her I was okay, just thinking. She understood, leaving me to process in my own way. Sebastian had already checked the room for recording devices, a habit we'd probably maintain for months to come. I pulled out the statement I'd written but never had to read in court. Pages describing years of isolation, the hunger for human contact, the slow death of sensation. I didn't need it anymore. My testimony had been enough. The judge had seen the truth. That's story time wrapped for today, folks. Appreciate you hanging out while I tossed in my thoughts. Catch you on the flip side. Subscribe for more content like this.